Welcome back, everyone. We're again here broadcasting from my apartment in Queens, New York, talking about this Chinese Communist Party virus, the CCP virus. And we're going to start today by talking about this documentary, this investigative documentary Epoch Times put together, which of course you probably saw me on. Now, if you shared this documentary on Facebook, you might have received a notice from Facebook every time you shared it, alerting you that it had false information. And many of you have, of course, shared this with me. You sent me screenshots and so on. Really, thank you for that. Now, we have at Epoch Times made a response to Facebook's actions. We point out several pretty serious issues with their declaration that this is a false video, that it has false news in it. Notably, a conflict of interest, a factual error in their actual fact-checking document, and a few other pretty serious issues. So let's go over this now. Now, of course, Facebook declared this documentary is false. In just a few days, this investigative documentary we put together, looking into the various evidence on where this virus comes from, looking into everything we can find on China, the research they were doing in the laboratories, this wet market narrative, even looking into this intern who may have caught the virus at this lab and spread it to her boyfriend. This is the story now circulating. The documentary covers all of this. It does not come to hard conclusions. It is merely meant to be a package of information, looking into what we can prove, showing what can be debunked, and putting this together in one place. Now, in just a few days, that documentary across all platforms had over 70 million views. It was going viral across multiple platforms. And then suddenly Facebook put a big stamp on it, declaring it was false. And so, here's the Epoch Times response to that. We state that, quote, the fact checker, quote unquote, appears to take issue with some of the expert opinions the documentary presents. With the Chinese Communist Party having destroyed evidence and prevented research into the origin of the virus, it's very difficult to draw any definitive conclusions. It's not the intent of the film to provide a definitive answer. And we, of course, note that after the video was published, after this documentary was published, there were a few news articles that actually corroborated our findings. One was the Washington Post, which reported that State Department cables from 2018 warned of safety issues at the Wuhan laboratory studying bat coronaviruses. The Washington Times reported, Joint Chiefs Chairman, U.S. Intel investigating whether coronavirus leaked from Wuhan lab. Fox News reported, quote, sources believe coronavirus originated in Wuhan lab as part of China's efforts to compete with U.S. And of course, we note a few serious issues with the Facebook fact check, which you all might find interesting. Now, number one, quote, the fact-checking is done based on an article published by the New York Post, not our documentary. There may be some overlap with respect to evidence, but a number of points cited have nothing to do with our documentary. In other words, the document they have, quote-unquote, debunking our findings wasn't even about our documentary. It was about a New York Post article, which somehow they put these together and claimed that we had the same information. Some of the information they claim to have debunked is not even present in our video. It's not present in our documentary, but they did this anyways. Number two, this is a bizarre one. The fact checker, Danielle Anderson, is not independent, as she states, quote, I will disclose that I am a scientist trained to work in high containment and have collaborative projects with the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which runs that laboratory in China. She adds, quote, I have worked in this exact laboratory at various times for the past 2 years. And she says, quote, I can personally attest to the strict control and containment measures implemented while working there. The staff at WIV are incredibly competent, hardworking, and are excellent scientists with superb track records. But of course, in journalism, this is what we would call a conflict of interest. This woman worked at the laboratory. Is her statement on what she saw there correct? Is she telling the truth? And even if she is telling the truth based on her observations while they're visiting, while they're working, were there other issues there that she was not aware of? Whistleblowers said otherwise. State Department cables said otherwise. Other information coming out says otherwise. So again, what is the true story here? Now, number 3, we state, quote, a key fact check claim is actually false. It said, quote, there is no evidence supporting claims that biosecurity is poor in the Wuhan Institute of Virology, or that lab animals are being sold or consumed. Now, this claim is false, as we note, based on these articles we mentioned in the post. In other words, one of the main claims Facebook used to debunk that video, quote unquote, or fact check it, actually had a factual error. This claim is false based on Articles 1 and 3, the Washington Post story and the Fox News story, claiming otherwise. And we also note in this statement, quote, the headline for the fact check, is, quote, scientific evidence indicates virus that causes COVID-19 infection is of natural origin, not the result of human engineering. And the highlighted fact check claims at the top of the page is, quote, evidence points to SARS-CoV-2 research being carried out at the Wuhan Institute of Virology, which is marked incorrect. Now, this fact check conflates the idea of lab origin with engineering. I mean, just coming from a lab, leaking from a lab doesn't mean human engineered. Of course, our documentary points to many possibilities. They were creating man-made viruses at that laboratory. They were creating synthetic viruses at that laboratory. They were working on many different things there. And they also had research, one of the top bat researchers in the world, actually, this Dr. Shi. And she was famous, notably, for finding the key in these bat coronaviruses that would allow them to infect human cells. That was one of the things she was famous for. And of course, they had viruses, bat coronaviruses, that did not need intermediary species. We show this in the research. This is again in addition to the chimeric viruses they were creating. A lab leak does not necessarily mean it was one of the viruses they created. It could have been a natural one. In fact, my own personal analysis is that this narrative coming out of China now, actually before even, but it's only being broadly reported now, that this intern who was working at the laboratory caught it from a bat and spread it outward, spread it from there. Personally, I think that's actually pretty plausible. I think that could be the case. But again, the Facebook fact check is conflating the idea of, quote, lab origin with, quote, engineering. Just saying it leaked from the lab doesn't mean it's man-made. And the Epoch Times is, of course, asking Facebook in our statement, quote, we call on Facebook to remove its incorrect label. Incorrect based on its factual error, its conflict of interest, its conflating lab origin with engineering, and allow more people to see this very timely documentary. At the Epoch Times, we are firm believers in freedom of the press, especially now as the global pandemic continues. It is vital for audiences around the world to be provided with independent and accurate information to make informed decisions. Now, Facebook had released a statement on this. They say, quote, ever since COVID-19 was declared a global pandemic health emergency in January, we've been working to connect people to accurate information from health experts and keep harmful misinformation about COVID-19 from spreading on our apps. It says it directed over 2 billion people to resources from the WHO, quote, and other health authorities, end quote, on both Facebook and on Instagram. And it states, quote, but connecting people to credible information is only half the challenge. Stopping the spread of misinformation and harmful content about COVID-19 on our apps is also critically important. They note that they're giving $1 million grants to fact-checking organizations through its fact-check network, and states, quote, once a piece of content is rated false by fact-checkers, we reduce its distribution and show warning labels with more context. And they state, quote, based on one fact-check, we're able to kick off similarity detection methods that identify duplicates of debunked stories. And presumably that's what they did falsely to this documentary, notably comparing it to this, analysis based on this New York Post story, which contained information ours did not have, and which tried to debunk information ours did not contain. Now, Mark Zuckerberg also wrote a statement. He said, quote, we're also continuing our efforts to reduce misinformation. Since the beginning of March, we've expanded our fact-checking coverage to more than a dozen new countries, and now work with over 60 fact-checking organizations that review content in more than 50 languages. In March, we displayed warnings about 40 million posts related to COVID-19 based on 4,000 articles reviewed by independent fact-checkers. When people saw those warning labels, 95% of the time, they did not go on to view the original content. And of course, as we showed in our breakdown of this whole thing, the fact-checkers they used had factual errors and also conflicts of interest. And so who fact-checks the fact-checkers, right? Now, moving on to an important point about this. Facebook appears to be working very closely with the WHO on this. And the WHO has ironically been one of the greatest sources of misinformation on this virus, basically acting as a hand puppet of the Chinese Communist Party. NBC had a story that says in the headline, quote, Facebook will steer users who interact with coronavirus misinformation to WHO. And it reports, quote, since January, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter have made sweeping moves to promote reliable information, pushing pop-ups and features directing users to websites of trusted health organizations like the WHO. Facebook has also provided the WHO and other health organizations fighting the coronavirus with free ads and continues to ban ads that promote fake coronavirus cures. Last month, Facebook unveiled a coronavirus information center, a home for information from local leaders and public health organizations. Now, where does this come from with the WHO? Let's go back to February 2nd, 2020, when the WHO released its strategy. And notably, in this document, where the WHO lays out its, quote, strategic objectives, it notes in its strategy for the response, it includes, quote, communicate critical risk and event information to all communities, quote, and counter misinformation. Why is the WHO involved in information operations? And they have a section in this report where they say, managing the 2019 NCOV, quote, infodemic. They're calling it the infodemic, a pandemic of information. And in this subsection of the report, it states, quote, the 2019 nCoV outbreak and response has been accompanied by a massive infodemic, an overabundance of information. So in other words, they're saying this quote-unquote infodemic is not necessarily false information, but an overabundance of information. And it states, quote, some accurate and some not. That makes it hard for people to find trustworthy sources and reliable guidance when they need it. And it also states, quote, due to the high demand for timely and trustworthy information about 2019 nCoV, WHO technical risk communication and social media teams have been working closely to track and respond to myths and rumors. Through its headquarters in Geneva, its 6 regional offices, and its partners, the organization is working 24 hours a day to identify the most prevalent rumors that can potentially harm the public's health, such as false prevention measures or cures. These myths are then refuted with evidence-based information. In other words, the WHO is running a 24-hour operation to identify what it calls fake information, misinformation, in this, quote, infodemic, an overabundance of information, both true and false. Now, what's interesting here, again, is the WHO has again been one of the greatest sources of disinformation on this virus. We'll be showing some evidence on this. But first, let's talk about a recent story from the World Tribune. Quote, Taiwan produces evidence it warned WHO of coronavirus in December. There's been a back and forth with Taiwan and the WHO. Taiwan claims that it warned the WHO of human-to-human transmission and of the spread of this virus in China in December. The WHO denies it. But it has happened now that on April 11th, the Taiwanese health minister Chen Shih-chung published the letter that they emailed. They made public this letter that they emailed to the WHO, showing that they warned them of human-to-human transmission. And specifically, they warned of an atypical pneumonia outbreak in China, where infected people had to be isolated. and they talk about the ability of this virus to spread. And Taiwan News also reported, quote, WHO turned down more than 70% of Taiwan's requests for technical meetings. And it notes that even in its documents, the WHO refers to Taiwan as being part of China, rather as an independent country, fitting the Chinese Communist Party's narrative on Taiwan. And of course, the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to deny Taiwan access to international organizations like the WHO, because doing so would legitimize Taiwan on the global stage. But with that said, let's go into some of the direct lies the WHO has told. And given the fact that the WHO is running 24-hour operations, as it states, to identify false information, as it claims, and because it's working closely with platforms such as Facebook to identify false information and label information false based on that, it may be useful to point out the false statements the WHO itself has made, because it's being called out for this right now. And not only called out for it, but being looked into, being investigated, as the United States has announced, the White House has announced, for possible special interest, possible cover-up of this virus when it may have known otherwise, when it may have known for a fact that this virus did have human-to-human transmission, that this virus is more dangerous than it at first appeared, and withheld information that led many parts of this world, many countries, being misled about it and being unprepared. Now, it just so happens the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation released a wonderful timeline showing this. And of course, the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation has now added the dead from this virus to the list of dead caused by communism. Now, I won't go over their entire timeline because it's very long, but they have a very interesting breakdown that shows the Chinese Communist Party's claims, the WHO's statements aligning with those claims, and then what the actual reality was at the time. Let's start with their section on misinformation praised as, quote, cooperation and transparency. Now, on January 22nd, 2020, Vice Minister of China's National Health Commission stated, "We will disclose information on the outbreak in a timely, open, and transparent manner, objectively reporting outbreak developments." On January 30, they reported, the CCP Foreign Ministry spokesperson Zhao Lijian quotes WHO saying, "China is committed to combating the transmission of the virus and has demonstrated cooperation with other countries. Its actions help prevent the spread of coronavirus to other countries." Now, when it comes to the WHO, here's what they were saying. Tedros, the head of the WHO, said on January 23rd, quote, "I would like to thank the government of the People's Republic of China for its cooperation and transparency." We've seen how transparent China is by now. January 30th, Tedros said, "I was in China just a few days ago, where I met with President Xi Jinping." Yeah, non-elected president, of course. "I left in absolutely no doubt about China's commitment to transparency and to protecting the world's people." And on January 30, he stated, "The speed with which China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with WHO and the world are very impressive and beyond words. So is China's commitment to transparency and to supporting other countries. WHO continues to have confidence in China's capacity to control the outbreak." So in other words, he's saying that China detected the outbreak, isolated the virus, sequenced the genome, and shared it with the WHO and the world, and that China was demonstrating its capacity to control the outbreak. Now, this was at a time when the WHO had the world convinced that China had the whole situation under control, that there was no pandemic. I'll get into this in a bit, that there was no need to talk about a pandemic because that was just fear-mongering. And what was the reality at that time? January 6, before any of these statements, CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield officially offers to send a CDC team into China, but is denied permission to enter the country. Chinese Communist Party denied entry to the CDC. January 12th, before either of their statements, Shanghai Public Health Clinical Center publishes the new virus genome sequence on open platforms. The CCP closes it the next day for rectification, hindering its COVID-19 research. January 26th, before some of the latter statements, at least the two latter ones of the WHO. Chinese social media platform WeChat enforces CCP Criminal Law Amendment 9, stating, quote, "Those who seriously disrupt the social order shall be sentenced to fixed-term imprisonment, detention, or control. Now keep in mind the Chinese Communist Party was arresting whistleblowers. It was arresting people who were speaking out about this, and under this statement they had, were telling people that spreading information online that did not fit the narrative of the Chinese Communist Party could result in a prison sentence. This was when Tedros was praising them of transparency. And February 11th, after these, CDC Principal Deputy Director Dr. Ann Schuchat said, quote, "We absolutely assume that the reported cases are an underestimate." In other words, China was lying about the number of cases. That was the assessment. Tedros at the WHO was saying otherwise. Moving on, free speech crackdown. February 6th, the CCP Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying said, quote, "We have noted some rumors and lies on this epidemic which are now worse than the virus itself. You may have noted that even WHO Director General has repeatedly called on people to not believe in rumors or spread them." Tedros said 2 days later, quote, "At WHO, we're not just battling the virus, we're also battling the trolls and conspiracy theorists that push misinformation and undermine the outbreak response." And this came just after February 7th, 1 day prior to Tedros, where whistleblower Dr. Li Wenliang died of the coronavirus. Chinese social media explodes with demands for an official apology and freedom of speech. Now, if you remember when this virus was first spreading in China, the Chinese Communist Party suppressed information. Doctors such as Dr. Li tried warning people about it. He was arrested, and he died of the virus soon after. He became a folk hero in China. The Chinese Communist Party was arresting citizen journalists who were recording footage and trying to warn the world about it. Tedros' statement at the WHO came 1 day after Dr. Li died. Now, and of course, notably when a lot of people on the Chinese internet were making a lot of noise about it. And also the virus origin blame game. I won't get into the whole thing here because there's quite a lot on this one. February 26th, Tedros at the WHO said, quote, "Using the word pandemic carelessly has no tangible benefit, but it does have significant risk in terms of amplifying unnecessary and unjustified fear and stigma and paralyzing systems. It may also signal that we can no longer contain the virus, which is not true." Tedros warning people to not use the word pandemic and stating it gives the picture that they cannot contain the virus, which he said, quote, "is not true." And he said, quote, on February 28, 2 days later, quote, "Our greatest enemy right now is not the virus itself, it's fear, rumors, and stigma. And our greatest assets are facts, reason, and solidarity." And of course, this came as the Chinese Communist Party was expelling journalists at major U.S. publications from China. And of course, soon after this, on March 11th, the WHO declared the coronavirus a pandemic, after it warned people to not call it a pandemic, and after it claimed that the virus could be contained, after Tedros himself said that calling it a pandemic may, quote, "also signal that we can no longer contain the virus, which is not true." Proved to be true. It proved to be a pandemic. And of course, before the WHO actually declared it a pandemic, here's what happened. March 10th, President Xi visits Wuhan to declare victory over the virus. March 9th, right before that, Tedros said, quote, "One of the 4 countries with the most cases, China is bringing its epidemic under control." And meanwhile, March 19th, local doctor says the number of coronavirus patients in Wuhan was manipulated in preparation for President Xi's visit. In other words, information was manipulated in Wuhan before Xi visited on March 10th. And the day before that, of course, Tedros backed up the Chinese Communist Party's numbers on that, which proved to be false. And again, 2 days after that, 2 days after he said China is bringing its epidemic under control, the WHO declared it a pandemic. And so again, who fact checks the fact checkers? And of course, folks, we're doing these broadcasts 5 days a week, Monday through Friday. If you can, please like and subscribe. We really need your support. If you're on YouTube, also click the notification bell. You'll get an alert when our new videos are up. Of course, if you haven't seen it, we hit 100,000 subscribers. So, I mean, appreciate it. It's thanks to all of you. Really appreciate the support. And of course, if you have questions, comments, things you want to let me know, leave it in the comments section. I do read them. Now, with that said, folks, we really appreciate the support. I'll see you next time.